Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for braving the elements tonight. There's a little wicked out there.
It's not a hurricane.
That is true. So I'm okay with it. So I want to thank you all for coming to the next edition of our guest speaker series. We are very happy to welcome Thomas Reigstad from Buffalo today. He is a Mark Twain scholar and professor emeritus of English at Buffalo State. And he just had a book come out this year, the Illustrated Mark Twain and the Buffalo Express. And he will be signing copies afterwards, so if you're interested. But he's going to talk about tonight about some of the places that Mark Twain was known to haunt in Buffalo while he was here. So there's a pun there, don't worry. So Tom, take it away.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to speak here tonight. As soon as I pulled in the parking lot, the heavens opened up and hail was pounding my car, so it was a nice greeting. Well, this evening, we are about to take a tour of places around West New York that were frequent hangouts for Mark Twain when he lived in Buffalo from 1869 to 1871, and even afterward, up until 1895. He visited Buffalo several times after he moved his family from Buffalo. And as kind of a Halloween treat, I guess, tonight, some of those haunts will reflect Twain's fascination with the ghostly and the spirit world, and could be considered slightly haunted. And maybe will be a pre-game warm-up for the next ghost walk in Batavia. Cemetery walk, whatever. The image that you see on the screen right now is of Twain proudly wearing a heavy sealskin coat and hat that he bought in Buffalo in 1871 at Berchtold Brothers Furriers on Main Street, right around the corner from his Buffalo Express newspaper offices, where he was co-owner, managing editor, and a reporter. And there are three areas of Western New York where Twain spent most of his time. Downtown, mostly east of Main Street and the waterfront. 2, the Delaware Avenue district, and 3, Niagara Falls. Turn on the... Most of us picture Mark Twain wearing his trademark white suit with a head of unruly white hair and a bushy mustache, and holding a stogie. But the 33-year-old Twain who walked downtown Buffalo streets in 1869 looked like this: a young journalist with reddish-brown hair, dressed as a typical white-collar worker in coat, vest, and tie. He'd already developed the habit of smoking cigars, though. When Twain first assumed co-ownership of the Buffalo Express in mid-August of 1869, he was a 33-year-old bachelor engaged to Olivia Langdon, the daughter of a wealthy coal dealer in Elmira, New York. For his first few months in Buffalo, so we're moving on to the sphere that he hung out in Buffalo in the downtown area. And for those first few months in Buffalo, he rented a one-room apartment in an upscale boarding house at 39 East Swan Street. It was steps away from his job at the Buffalo Express. If you know downtown Buffalo and where the Buffalo Bisons play ball at Salem Field, at about the Swan Street entrance would be where 39 East Swan Street once stood. It was steps away from his job at the Buffalo Express. Twain boasted to his fellow boarders that he smoked as many as 12 cigars a day in his room. And the boarding house is encircled. And note, here on Main Street, this building at 291 Main was Berchtold Brothers Furriers, where he bought that sealskin coat and cap. And it was right around the corner from where he was staying as a boarder. And the Buffalo Express offices, excuse me, were right about in here, kind of kitty corner from the Express. To get your bearings, This is Washington Street, heading down toward KeyBank Arena. And this is Main Street, heading south toward the waterfront. And this is East Swan Street. But this photo was taken in 1870 from the steeple of St. Paul's Episcopal, which was the tallest point in Buffalo at the time. It was being repaired, so there was some scaffolding there, and an enterprising photographer named Pond scurried up there and took 360-degree photographs of Buffalo in 1870. And I love this picture, this aerial view, because it shows how prosperous and thriving Buffalo was already. When Twain moved here, there were 110,000 people, and it was a boom town. It was growing by thousands of people in terms of population every year. The Express itself, circled there at 14 East Swan Street, between Main and Washington, was a 4-story building, as you can see, with the printing presses in the basement. And editorial reporters and editors' offices were on the 3rd floor. And Twain's own cubbyhole office was on the 3rd floor, the middle window. So he had, from August and September, when the weather was still pretty mild, a bird's eye view of all the commerce and traffic going on at busy East Swan Street between Washington and Main. And in fact, in August of 1869, he published a blurb in the Express complaining about the monotonous tune he had to listen to all day coming from a hurdy-gurdy man that was set up on a nearby corner. And this is the blurb, but it's kind of fuzzy to read. I'll read it. The foreign gentleman who has recently located himself on the opposite sidewalk with a hand organ of 2-tune capacity will oblige us if he will play the other tune sometimes. Buffalo Gales is fresh and exciting, but one notices after several days that it lacks variety. This person's organ is a greater bore than the Hoosac Tuttle. On one memorable occasion in 1869, a healer called on the Express. Twain dropped what he was doing and consulted with the visitor. While his newsroom colleagues watched, Twain held his hands above the healer's bald head, and Twain claimed to feel a cool, curative energy radiating from the man's polished pate. Thus, Twain had a brush with phrenology, a pseudoscience that was popular in his day. That fall, Twain also wrote 2 light pieces in the Express about mysticism. One about a celebrated young lady clairvoyant who claimed to see with her eyes shut the contents of pockets in coats in distant rooms. Twain wrote that Buffalo families should be spared her talents lest she go through their pockets. He also published a humorous account of the visiting fortune teller in Boston, whom he was able to follow through the dark hallways of her house because of the trail left by her garlicky breath, and who predicted that he would be elected to Congress and then be sent to the penitentiary. Continuing our focus on Twain's downtown area, he attended Lafayette Square Presbyterian Church, both before he got married and after he got married. And the church was at the current site of the Rand Building in Lafayette Square today. Twain also spent lots of time socializing in St. James Hall at Main and East Eagle, the cultural hub of the city. It housed the Young Men's Association, the only circulating library in Buffalo, and the forerunner of today's Buffalo and Erie County Public Library system. Twain was a dues-paying member of the Young Men's Association from 1869 to 1872. He also belonged to the Nameless Club, a literary circle that met in the second-floor library room of the Young Men's Association, and the only public lecture that Twain gave in Buffalo while living here was in the auditorium of the Young Men's Association in March of 1870. Occasionally during August and September, Twain would stroll from his boarding house to the waterfront for a refreshing swim or row in Lake Erie. And this sandboard map shows I circled where the Buffalo Express office was. Again, this is Main Street, this is East Swan. Here's his boarding house. So he'd leave his boarding house, walk down East Swan to Michigan, and turn toward the waterfront to rent a rowboat or to take a brief dip in the water. Twain's path to the beach started from the boarding house and south on Michigan toward the harbor. His trip down Michigan took him past numerous tinsmiths, taverns, smokehouses, lumber yards, offices, warehouses, and sheds. At Michigan and Ohio, there were 7 saloons in one block, at least one of which may have beckoned to indulge him in a cool 5-cent glass of lager to fortify him for the walk back home. Sir, there's chairs up here. Another waterfront destination of Twain's, and I'll just show you the completion of that walk where you actually get to the harbor to swim or boat.
What are those train tracks on the right there?
Yes. Buffalo already had a vibrant, rail industry. And another waterfront destination of Twain's was his father-in-law's coal yard at the Erie Basin. Jervis Langdon from Elmira had a very key Buffalo branch office, as you can imagine, at the western terminus of the Erie Canal, where the coal was mined in Pennsylvania and shipped north onto the Erie Canal or by rail to various customers. When it got to Buffalo, either by rail or barge, he had a lot of customers across the Great Lakes. So it was a key office. And this is a view of the Erie Basin at the foot of Erie Street in 1870, when Twain lived here. And this is a map, a drawing of the J.J. Langdon Coal Company's coal yard, which was at the foot of Genesee Street in the Erie Basin. You can see tracks there too. Jervis Langdon was a good friend of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the president of New York Central Railroad, and conveniently, he had a spur of the New York Central right on his coal yard. So the coal could be delivered there by barge and picked up loaded onto trains and sent to all kinds of destinations on land. Twain was known to inspect that coal yard when he lived in Buffalo, and even co-owned that very property for the last 6 years of his life, from 1904 to 1910. A few blocks east of Twain's boarding house was the thriving East Side Brewery neighborhood in Buffalo. In Twain's day, Buffalo boasted 22 maltsters and 33 breweries. This massive one, the Jacob Bruce Brewery was on Pratt Street on the east side. While Twain still lived in Buffalo, in January of 1871, the Buffalo Common Council approved naming an alley bordering the Bruce Brewery after him in honor of his fondness for beer. And it was called Twain Alley, you can see where it's circled there, for another 50 years or so. It still shows up on the maps labeled in the early 1930s. But then the alley was truncated and built on a little bit, and there never was signage except on maps. But you can still see vestiges of the alley today in the Pratt and Hickory and Broadway area, that neighborhood. Another Buffalo haunt of Twain's was the Upper Crust Delaware District. This, in early February of, what I was going to say is that Delaware Street wasn't changed to Avenue until 1877, became Twain's home turf. It was the Boulevard, a prestigious promenade with block after block, of mansions occupied by old and new millionaires. In early February of 1870, he and Olivia Langdon, 10 years younger than him, were married in Elmira, New York, in a very small private ceremony. The next day, February 2nd of 1870, they took a train to Buffalo and were greeted by a wedding gift from her parents, of a mansion at 472 Delaware Street, complete with 3 servants, a large attached carriage house, a horse, a sleigh, and a carriage.
She didn't come for money, did she?
Not much,
No.
and he made optimum use of it during his life. This lithograph, colorized lithograph of Twain's Delaware neighborhood, was drawn from the steeple of Westminster Presbyterian Church, looking south down Delaware to the waterfront. Just past the heavily wooded area here, this is going south toward the waterfront, was where Twain's house was, where 472 Delaware was. It was near near the northwest corner of Virginia and Delaware. A lot of people think that it was on the corner, but it was 2 houses in north of Virginia on Delaware. Strangely, a factory, the Cornell White Lead Works, operated directly across the street. And you can see it right there in the map. And here's a photograph of it. Just a real anomaly in that neighborhood of mansions up and down the street. But it was a very prosperous business, and it operated 24/7. And you can imagine, I looked it up once, and to make white lead, they would make sheets and pipes and all sorts of things. One of the byproducts, a lot of the byproducts were toxic, and one of them was arsenic. And they had those 2 towers, belching out that kind of stuff, and Twain lived right across the street. And we'll get to some possibilities of complications for his wife's health in a few minutes that may have led from that, the stuff that was spewing out of those smokestacks. Also, I'll just backtrack here, sort of kitty corner from Twain's house was Morris Gwynn's house. He was a banker. And I'll just show one more picture of the interior of Twain's house. There aren't very many of them. And this is a rare one of the staircase when he entered the house and through the front door. But in 1870, the Buffalo City Directory lists Twain by his given name, Samuel Clemens, and Samuel L. Clemens. And there's the entry. And of course, there were no phones yet, so it was just names, professions, home, or residence or address or business address, that sort of thing. But a few entries down, you'll notice, is Grover Cleveland, a young attorney with Lanning and Folsom, on the same page of the city directory. And they became good friends. While Twain was living in Buffalo, young Grover Cleveland started his political career. He was elected Erie County Sheriff in 1870. And when Twain was still a bachelor, in the fall of 1869, he and Cleveland were known to frequent a saloon or 2 together. Perhaps Ulrich's, if you know where that is, on Ellicott in Virginia, in Buffalo. It's known for, I think, fish fries and stuff like that. It's kind of an Irish bar to this day, but back then it was more German. And legend has it that that was one of the taverns that they would go to together to have a brew. And they stayed good friends. When Cleveland was elected governor of New York, Twain visited him in Albany in the relatively new, state office building in Albany. And on that visit, in fact, Twain was waiting for him in the governor's office, and there was a table with all kinds of buttons on it to call different assistants. And Twain backed up and leaned on a couple of buttons, and he was swarmed by different officials, assistants of Grover Cleveland, and he made a joke about it. And then Cleveland walked in, and they just had a good time. One of the terms that Cleveland served as president, I can't remember which one, Twain visited him and his bride, Frances Folsom, at the White House and had dinner. And one of his treasured objects was a calling card that Frances Folsom gave him and autographed on the back. He was really smitten by her. I guess she was just gorgeous. On a quiet Sunday afternoon at 472 Delaware Avenue, only 3 days after Twain and Olivia moved into that house, with snow falling and Olivia napping upstairs, Twain found himself alone in the library room and wrote a remarkable letter to his best friend about growing up together in Hannibal, Missouri. Twain, in the letter, records a sweeping set of childhood memories in stream of consciousness style. He fondly recalls people, places, and events, and the Epiphany secures Buffalo's role as the place where he first mined his creative motherlode, the matter of Hannibal, that was to provide models for images and scenes and characters that he would use 15 years later in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and even earlier in 1876 is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. On another Sunday morning, the next month, Twain noticed flames coming from the roof of a house across the street. He and his coachman raced over to 455 Delaware to assist. Twain is said to have drolly introduced himself to his new neighbor, Morris Gwynn, the banker, thusly: "My name is Clemens. We ought to have called upon you before, and I beg pardon for intruding now in this informal way. But your house is on fire." Still another encounter with Delaware Street neighbors came on Memorial Day weekend of 1870, anticipating constant dust likely to be stirred up into his windows from nonstop carriages passing by on the dirt boulevard over the busy holiday weekend. Trump. Where did that come from? Twain published, Grumpy, that's what I saw. Twain and Grumpy. I'll never make that mistake again. Twain published a grumpy editorial in his Express, signed 472 Delaware. And I'll read the editorial. He put the headline, "Street Sprinkling," on it. "The manner in which Delaware Street is sprinkled above Virginia is simply ridiculous. A crippled infant with a garden squirt could do it better. The work is done by the city government and paid for by the property owners along the street. And the pay is amply secured and the work contracted for 3 years. Now, one thing or the other is absolutely true. Vis-a-vis, either the contractor is not paid enough to justify him in doing his work well, or else he shamefully shirks his duty. Which is it?" Signed 472 Delaware. Now, everyone in the city knew who lived at 472 Delaware, including Jane Welch, a 16-year-old neighbor who rallied her brother and a few other kids in the neighborhood to use watering cans on Delaware Street in front of Twain's house all weekend to keep the surface damp and the dust at a minimum. When the weekend was over, Twain walked down to her house just a few doors north on Delaware and thanked her and met her mother and grandmother in person. Note the lovely grass median between the north and south sides of Delaware, or east and west sides, I should say, of Delaware. The traffic would go north and south on the respective sides. And you can kind of make out the hitching posts that dotted the landscape, and carriage stones as well, for ladies all dressed in their finery, to step out of the carriage and not get muddy or wet in inclement weather. But the house in the center was Jane Welch's. Although Twain and Olivia mostly worshiped at Lafayette Square Presbyterian Church, as I mentioned, they were also known to attend Westminster Presbyterian Church, which they could easily walk to at Delaware and North. They preferred Westminster's choir over that of Lafayette's. One of Twain's most macabre satires, A Curious Dream, which appeared in 2 parts in the Buffalo Express in April and May of 1870, was written about a deteriorating cemetery across from Westminster Church, the old North Street Cemetery. In the story, Twain describes himself sitting on the front steps at midnight, chatting with skeletons, lugging their coffins as they abandoned the rundown cemetery because it was not a fit place to live in, quote unquote, anymore. And here's how Twain's friend and illustrator, True Williams, depicted the scene. This is one of the drawings that's in the new book that just came out in February. Delaware District cemeteries, in fact, seemed to obsess Twain for years. In a brief stopover in Buffalo in 1895, he asked a friend for a carriage ride to Forest Lawn Cemetery in order to see the famed Blocher family memorial, an ornate monument installed in 1888 and constructed out of 150 tons of stone at a cost of $100,000 with 3 life-sized white marble figures of the John Blocher family enclosed in glass. Although thousands of visitors were attracted to the Blocher monument annually, and it's still a tourist attraction, Twain was disappointed. He had hoped to use the monument for his writing, but in the end said that it did not stir him. In November of 1870, Twain's first child, a son, Langdon Clemens, was born at 472 Delaware. The baby was born a month premature and was extremely sickly. Sadly, he died of diphtheria at only 19 months of age after they had moved from Buffalo. Shortly after young Langdon's death in Hartford, Twain and his wife commissioned a Buffalo artist, Augusta Graves, to create a plaster bust modeled after Langdon's death mask, which we see here. For many years, the death mask and the plaster bust were hidden in a green box, stored in a closet off the study in their Hartford home. The green box was even kept secret from their 3 daughters. The mask and bust continued to remain unknown, even to Twain's surviving relatives, until the late 1930s, 30 years after his death. Around 1960, the Langdon family ordered a bronze reproduction of the plaster bust, which is now in the collection of Elmira's Arnott Art Museum. It's usually in storage, but once in a while they have it out on exhibit. The house at 472 Delaware stood until 1963, when a damaging fire resulted in the building having to be demolished. According to the last owner of the house, hidden tongue-and-groove compartments were found in some of the wainscoting, where panels slid up waist-high, revealing long, dried-out, empty, flat pint bottles of whiskey. Now, whether they belonged to Twain or not is a matter of conjecture. In 1964, the Cloister Restaurant opened at the site, and the restaurant celebrated its ties to Mark Twain with pewter warming plates for their diners. Did anyone ever eat at the Cloister? I ate there once. I don't remember how I was able to afford it a long time ago. Their menus even were like a newspaper, and they had pictures of the Twain house and a little bio of Twain and Olivia. I once interviewed a young woman who served as a cocktail waitress at the Cloister when she was 19 in the early 1970s, and who also happened to be a medium. She told me of a psychic vision that she once experienced while cleaning up the restaurant's library room. Suddenly, she saw Twain's spirit and felt a ghostly vibration. As she put it, he was definitely there, no question. I noticed, felt his figure, his spirit. I felt his mirth, his energy. Even after the Cloister closed in 1988, Twain's spirit on that site persisted. The former restaurant building had become the offices of the weekly newspaper Business First of Buffalo. An editor of Business First once told me that the staff was well aware of the thread connecting them to Mark Twain, a fellow newspaperman, and that they knew that they were sharing space with Twain, doing the same thing, reporting and editing. As the Business First editor also said, when I parked my car in front, I was aware that Mark Twain inhabited the same space. It was the very stoop where he once entered the front door of his house. The last of Twain's haunts in western New York centers on Niagara Falls. Of course, our natural wonder in our backyard, and the tourist attraction that he visited and wrote about. His first visit was for a few days in the late summer of 1869. He stayed at the posh Cataract House. And this is a photograph of it taken from Goat Island. The picnickers are on Goat Island, and across the river and the rapids is the Cataract House. It's a very expensive, prestigious hotel. And Twain visited there still as a bachelor in late July and early August of 1869 with his future in-laws and future bride. He stayed in room 31. This is the registry, and he is, I know it's hard to see, but he signed in as Mark Twain, room 31. And Jervis Langdon, his wife, and Olivia were in rooms 31 and 33. They were very trusting to have Twain in the room next to their daughter. Come to think of it. 3 weeks later, he wrote a comic two-part story on Niagara Falls in the Buffalo Express, ridiculing the commercialism rampant throughout the grounds. His false stories were accompanied by illustrations from the Express staff artist, John Harrison Mills. This one reflects Twain's ridicule in the story of photographers and carriage cab drivers who would rip off tourists. They would just descend on them as soon as they leave their hotels and have their hands out for opportunities to take pictures of the tourists and their families with the falls behind them, or the cab drivers would charge exorbitant rates to take them around to Goat Island or the Whirlpool or other sites. Another drawing that accompanied one of those Twain stories about Niagara Falls was done by True Williams, and it spoofs the falls, as Twain wrote in the story, as a perfect fishing spot because fish never bite there. And Williams has Twain, a likeness of Twain actually, sitting, perched at the top of, I think it's the Horseshoe Falls in this case, with a picnic basket and with a, riding reel out. In 1886, Twain and his family visited the falls and again stayed at the Cataract. You can see he signed at the bottom here, S.L. Clemens family, Hartford, Connecticut. And that time they stayed on the third floor. And he checked in, as I said, as S.L. Clemens, which again kind of reflects his lifelong flip-flopping between his celebrity trademark pen name, Mark Twain, and his efforts sometimes to keep, his family, domestic, private life separate and, be known as S.L. Clemens, Sam Clemens. In December of 1884, Twain returned to Buffalo with another writer named George Washington Cable as part of their joint lecture tour. During his presentation at the concert hall that was located at Main and Edwards Streets, Twain treated a sellout audience to an excerpt from Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Here's the program. And Huckleberry Finn was about to be published in just 2 months in the United States. So Twain read a passage from chapter 14, where Huck Finn and the slave Jim argue about the biblical figure King Solomon. A really crucial moment in the novel when Huck begins recognizing Jim as a human being and as a caring parent. So Solomon is King Solomon. Twain read that place.
I see it's misspelled probably as a joke. It's Solomon,
Yeah, it's actually not so much a joke as the shtick that Twain used in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which was remarkable then, telling the story through Huck's eyes, using the vernacular of a 12-year-old uneducated river kid. Yeah.
Right.
So that's how he and Jim would pronounce
Right.
King Solomon. But yeah, good observation. During Twain's performance, he also read, at the bottom you can see, a story called A Ghost Story that he had published in the Buffalo Express 14 years earlier. In A Ghost Story, Twain satirizes the materialistic success of the recent, back in 1869 anyway, Cardiff Giant hoax in central New York. In that story, Twain is the narrator, and he's haunted in his hotel room by the clumsy ghost of the Cardiff Giant, who tells Twain that he himself has been as duped as the public by the swindle, by the hoax. And here's an illustration. Oh, and this is how it looked from the columns of the Buffalo Express. And this is a drawing that True Williams produced to accompany the publication of that story. The ghost is, of course, of the Cardiff Giant is kind of fuzzy there on purpose. Also, to backtrack to Huckleberry Finn, this lecture was in December of 1884 in Buffalo, and Huckleberry Finn came out just in early 1885. Within a year of its publication, a bookish young attorney in Buffalo named James Fraser Gluck, who was serving on the Buffalo Library Board, wrote a letter to Mark Twain, and this is just part of it, in 1885, requesting from Twain the handwritten manuscript of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Those things really weren't collector's items that much, but the lawyer, Gluck, had this vision of collecting autographs of writers, rare books, and handwritten manuscripts, and making a colossal collection, and paying for some of them, getting some as donations. And he did give a gift twice of a mammoth amount of these things to the Buffalo Library, including the handwritten manuscript of Huckleberry Finn. So within days, Twain got the letter and sent a huge chunk of that manuscript right away, and then eventually sent the whole thing. So I'm just going to close by urging you to visit the Mark Twain room. This is the front page of the handwritten manuscript. And Twain even had some instructions for the printers, because he had studied printing as a teenager in Hannibal, Missouri. He knew the trade pretty well. But this is the Mark Twain room on the main floor of the Central Library in downtown Buffalo at Lafayette Square. They have on exhibit pages of the handwritten manuscript of Huckleberry Finn, which they own. And they change those pages every so often so you can see what it looks like. It's also available online now, and there's a kiosk in the Mark Twain room where you can check out all the pages of the manuscript if you want to. The current special exhibit in the Mark Twain room is Mark Twain in miniature. And there's a tiny book of Huckleberry Finn. All the pages, all the chapters in one of the glass cases. I also encourage you to take a look at a life-size sculpture of Mark Twain that's in the lobby of the Ellicott Square building. That's on Swan in Maine and Washington. It's at the site of where Twain worked at the Buffalo Express. So it's perfectly positioned. That's kind of neat to see. And last, if you've never seen it, there's a gorgeous mural painted on the side of a building in North Buffalo by a Brazilian muralist. The building is at Virgil and Hurdle in North Buffalo. And it's based on a photo of Twain and a good friend of his named John Lewis, who was a free slave, a free black man, I should say, who was an employee of the Langdon family in Elmira. And Twain spent 20 summers in Elmira, staying with his in-laws up on a hill at a place called Quarry Farm, just outside of downtown Elmira. And he would do his writing there in a study that was designed for him. And he got to know, all the people associated with the Langdon family, and became very good friends with John Lewis. Some people think he was somewhat the model for the character of Jim in the novel Huckleberry Finn. But back to the mural for a second. In the upper corner there, that white image is clearer when you see the mural in person. And the muralist painted Halley's Comet. When Twain was born, November 30th of 1835, Halley's Comet appeared. And, you know, it recurs every 75 years. And as an adult, he predicted that he would go out with Halley's Comet, and he did. He died in April of 1910, in his 75th year. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And as Ryan mentioned, I brought a couple of books. One is a biography of Twain's life and times in Buffalo. It came out in 2018. And then the new book, the hardcover, just came out in February. It's a collection of 10 of Twain's most comic stories for the Buffalo Express in 1869 and 1870. And they're all accompanied by illustrations, some by the staff artist that he worked with in the Buffalo Express, some by True Williams, who was a noted illustrator of the day, and then Bill Watterson, the Calvin and Hobbes cartoonist, has a drawing in there, and two Pulitzer Prize winning editorial cartoonists, Tom Tolles and Adam Ziglis, also have several drawings in there. So, does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes, Bill?
Did Buffalo ever appear in any of Twain's novels?
No. No. Good question. But some of the writing that he did while in Buffalo appeared. Like you got to start on his next book, Roughing It. He'd written Innocents Abroad, his first major book, just weeks before he came to Buffalo. And it was a runaway bestseller. It's still considered America's first nonfiction bestseller. And royalties started coming in while he was single and a married man in Buffalo. And he was so excited about, having written this best-selling book that he signed a contract for another one called Roughing It, which eventually came out in 1872 after he left Buffalo. But some of the writing he did in Buffalo for the Buffalo Express, not about Buffalo, but about his time out west during the period of the Civil War, which he evaded, to put it nicely. Anyway, those writings that he published in the Express found their way in Roughing It. But he did use the name of someone that he met in Buffalo, John J. McWilliams, who was an employee, a clerk for the Langdon Buffalo coal office, to write a series of detective stories, short stories, not novels. Other questions? Or
Did he have any perceived ailment when the other guy laid hands on his head, or was he just screwing around?
Oh, he was just goofing around.
The other question I had is, what caused him to move so many different places? I've been to Hartford, been in his house, 200 yards away is Harriet Beecher Stowe's house.
Right.
But Elmira, big sign, all the famous people here, including Mark Twain. So what caused him to move all those different places?
Well, he didn't really move to Elmira, except for a short period when they moved, when Olivia and Twain and the baby moved from Buffalo in mid-March of 1871. They took a train to Elmira and stayed with her mother, who was a widow by that time, for a short period of time before moving to Hartford, Connecticut, which was like an epicenter of culture. Twain had originally wanted to join the Hartford Courier newspaper, and he had looked into a Cleveland newspaper and the New York Tribune, but instead was kind of coaxed by his father-in-law and given money to invest in the Buffalo Express. Anyway, they only lived in Elmira for a very short time before going to Hartford, and then they built the mansion there and lived there for 17 years. It was the most stable part of Twain's life, really, because he left home in Hannibal when he was about 16 and was a bit of a vagabond, an itinerant printer, and then out west as a reporter and a miner, a silver miner. He settled in Buffalo, only lived in Buffalo for a total of 17 months. What caused him to leave Buffalo was a number of factors. I think the book's success, and he was writing also for a literary magazine out of New York City. So he was taking on the airs of an author, and he wanted to leave the grind of journalism behind, the daily grind. So that was a factor. And also, he had his wife's inheritance, that you alluded to. Back then, I think it was $500,000. And in today's terms, I've never done an inflation calculator to figure out, but it'd be astronomical. So they built this huge house in Hartford. But another reason for leaving Buffalo was the tragedies that they experienced. His beloved father-in-law died just 6 months into their marriage when they were still living in Buffalo. He died in August of 1870 of stomach cancer. And Olivia was overcome by grief and observing strict Victorian codes of upper society of mourning, and was housebound
For like a year, right?
visitors. Yeah, it didn't last that long in their case because they left the city before that year was lapsed. But in the meantime, she invited a girlfriend of hers from Elmira, Emma Nye, who was a teacher in Michigan, to stop by on her way to Michigan at the end of the summer to stay with her and cheer her up a little bit, maybe console her. Emma did come to Buffalo, stayed at their house on Delaware, and came down with typhoid fever, got worse and worse, and died in September in their master bedroom. And that didn't do much for Olivia's mental health. And by that time, Olivia was in her third trimester of pregnancy, and she had a near miscarriage in October of 1870, and was frail and ill from that. And then, just a few days later, in early November, gave birth to that premature baby who was only 4 pounds, and it was at death's door the entire rest of the time they lived in Buffalo, from November of 1870 to mid-March of 1871. She couldn't even feed him. They had a wet nurse come. They had to take the baby to Buffalo General Hospital for a wet nurse, and Olivia couldn't even go with them because in the meantime, she also came down with typhoid fever in their house, and it was a revolving door of relatives and nurses and doctors. She got over the typhoid fever, but had to be carried out of the house when they moved on a mattress to the carriage. And then when the carriage got to the Exchange Street station in downtown Buffalo, she's carried on that same mattress to the train, and that's where they went to Elmira for a couple of months to help recover before they went on to Hartford. After the 17 years in the Hartford home, where they raised 3 daughters, and it was a pretty stable time, as I said, then Twain's total lack of financial sense destroyed the family. He declared bankruptcy by 1895. He had his own publishing company that published Grant's memoirs, and it was very successful, but he gave most of the money to the Grant family, to his credit, and it bailed out Grant's widow and children. But that printing company, publishing company, went belly up in 1894. And again, to his credit, Twain worked his way out of bankruptcy, and by the time he died, he was well off again, pretty well off. But during that rough financial period, he also invested and persuaded relatives and friends to invest in a printing press that was supposed to revolutionize the printing industry. Instead, his printing press, the Page typesetter, was competing with the Mergenthaler linotype machine. And when they have competing demonstrations, his press would always break down because it had a million movable parts. So newspapers, didn't buy it, and he was out like $100,000. And So anyway, because they were so destitute, they had to get rid of the Hartford house, and they moved to Europe, where it's cheaper to live. They lived in Austria, Germany, Italy. They were sort of expatriates, and he would try to make money on lecture tours, and he finally got under the tutelage of Henry Huddleston Rogers, who was the CEO of Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, and he guided Twain's finances to get him back well in the black by the time he died in 1910. But during the 1890s, they lived, all over the place, but mostly in Italy. And that's where Olivia died. She wasn't even 60 years old, of a weak heart. But as you said, I think that they're all buried in the cemetery in Elmira. And I've been there a couple of times, and every time I've been there, there's people taking pictures. It's a tourist attraction. Twain's family, if you're curious. Oh, yes.
I did get to tour the house in Hartford. Now, who's the other famous writer right in the area?
Harriet Beecher Stowe was a neighbor. It was an artist's colony called Nook Farm, N-O-O-K. And that's where Twain built his house. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's house was there. And Charles W. Warner, who co-wrote a novel, The Gilded Age, with Mark Twain, and was a newspaper man, also lived on the grounds. But then the Stowe house is preserved as a museum. The Twain house is beautifully, preserved. Some of the furnishings are from the Delaware Avenue home. There's a big mirror and a bureau and a couple of beds that came from the Buffalo home that are restored there. Anyway, Twain continued to experience personal tragedy. His wife died. She was 10 years younger, but she died 6 years before he did. They lost their first daughter, Susie, who's only 25 years old, of spinal meningitis. And Twain wasn't even there. He got a telegram that she was dead. He was lecturing in Great Britain at the time. And he and Olivia, even though they had 2 other daughters, never got over that loss of Susie. He was Twain's favorite. And Olivia even got involved in, and they both would participate in seances to try to communicate with her. Olivia got involved in palmistry and spiritualism to, again, try to commune, but, they apparently never really made a connection. And then another daughter of Twain's, Jean, died on Christmas Eve. She was, I think, 29 or so, in a home in Connecticut. And they had a couple of homes in New York City, too. Talk about hopscotching around. On Fifth Avenue and in the Riverside section, and 2 homes in Connecticut. And that's where Twain died, in Reddington, Connecticut, in 1910. The only child to outlive Twain was his daughter, Clara. She had a daughter, Nina, who never had children. So Twain's direct bloodline, was extinguished. Lots of Clemenses around, but yes.
Could you tell us how you fell in love with Mark Twain? Was it as a child, like most of us did? And how did you decide to pursue it academically? Plus, could you tell us more about that cartoonist? I'm surprised he's even living, because Courier Express has been gone forever.
Yeah, I worked at the Courier. Right up until the last night, September 19th, 1982.
Wonderful.
It's stamped in my,
Okay.
I was a copy editor
Could
there.
you brag a little bit about him as an illustrator?
Oh, sure. I've met him, but Adam Ziglis, Tom Tolles, who I mentioned,
Yes.
was a staff artist at the Courier, fresh out of graduating from University of Buffalo in the mid-1970s. And the drawings that are in this book appeared in the Buffalo Courier Express Sunday magazine in 1978. The editor of the Sunday magazine ran a series of reprinting 4 of Mark Twain's original Buffalo Express stories from 1869 to 1870. And Tom Tolles was a staff artist, and he was asked to, do some funny drawings. And when you see them in here, if you remember Tom Tolles as an editorial cartoonist at the Courier Express, at the Buffalo News, and then at the Washington Post, he won a Pulitzer Prize for it at the Buffalo News. His style is right there, very definable in those cartoons accompanying the Buffalo Express stories by Twain. But I knew Tom a little bit, I worked nights and he was mostly days in the editorial floor. But I've gotten to know him since. In fact, when I contacted him for permission, those drawings, 13 of them, from the 1978 Courier Express Sunday magazine have never been reproduced. When I asked him for permission, he didn't even remember drawing them. It was that long ago. So you're right, it was a long time ago. The other editorial cartoonist who's around, Adam Ziglis, who did this caricature of Twain, the way he looked at the Express, sort of. And then on the back cover, an elderly, Twain. And then two original drawings accompanying a story called Arthur that Twain wrote in 1869. A hilarious story about a visit by Queen Victoria's youngest son, Arthur, Prince Arthur, who was visiting the colonies, Canada, and while he was there, he wanted to see Niagara Falls. And when he was in Niagara Falls, Ontario, or Canada, he told his retinue that he wanted to see the Niagara grain elevator, which had made a lot of headlines around the world. The newest grain elevator in Buffalo. So he took a little train trip from the Falls to Buffalo at the spur of the moment. And Millard Fillmore and some other dignitaries had to get a lunch for him and stuff. And Twain was one of the reporters covering the prince's visit, all of 4 hours to Buffalo. And he makes fun of him, as you can imagine.
Could you tell us more about that one? And then could you tell us the prices? And do you take credit card, cash, or how are we to pay?
A lot of questions there. I'll go in reverse order. I don't have any kind of Venmo or mechanism for credit cards, but I accept cashes, checks I should say, and cash of course. The Red Book came out in 2018, Scribblin for Livin, Mark Twain's Pivotal Period in Buffalo is the subtitle. And it's the life and times of Twain in Buffalo. From 1869 to 1871, and even after, because he did visit Buffalo several times after he moved from here. But it's a story about two upward trajectories: Twain's career in Buffalo and in Buffalo as a city, a character in itself, almost in the book. I hope, as just blossoming with industry and its port and the rail industry and everything. That one, the paperback, the red one is $20. The hardcover is $25. It's kind of a bargain because it's really a couple dollars more. It's $26.95, but I don't want to make change for that, so $25 is easier for me. Yes.
Have you been to Hannibal?
I went to graduate school at the University of Missouri, and to answer your first question, that's really how I got interested in this corner of Mark Twain research, Twain's time in Buffalo. I am a fourth generation Buffalonian. I grew up here and went to the University of Buffalo as an English major, studied Twain, but I never knew that he lived in Buffalo until I went to the University of Missouri and took a seminar on Twain and read a biography of Twain that had come out in 1966. This is 3 years later that I was in grade school. And there was a chapter devoted to Twain's time in Buffalo. And I got really intrigued. But the biographer really wrote it off as inconsequential. He called Buffalo a city of hard luck and cold winds for Twain. And he was right in part, but he didn't say much about his friends or what he wrote here or anything. So that gave me an opportunity, and I wrote a paper for that course. And then when I got back to Buffalo after a few more years, I spent a lot of time on microfilm readers and getting the whole context of the city that Twain lived in at the time and how he wrote stuff. And met a lot of people who were descendants of people that Twain was friends with in Buffalo. And he had quite a wide social network, I discovered. So that's what that book is about. And that's pretty much the origin of my really 50-year odyssey now, researching Twain's connection to Buffalo.
How did you leave the paper to go to Buff State, or were you working nights and days?
I was working nights and days. I was a part-time copy editor nights at the Courier up until '82. And I had started at Buffalo State as an English professor in 1981. But I worked there for another 35 years.
Wow.
So, yeah. So that's enough about me. I like my shoes. But okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. Just a very quick PSA of everything coming up. It's a very busy month here at the museum. Tomorrow night is trivia night. We're going to be at Go Art, and it's on the Roaring 20s. So you can come have a drink at the tavern and learn about the speakeasies and everything else. So that's at 7 o'clock. We have our West Side Ghost Walk. The first one is this Friday. There are still some tickets available. We have one at 7 and one at 7:30. Then next weekend we have, or next Friday, we have our downtown Ghost Walk. We might have a spot left for one of those, but we might be sold out. Check the website for details. And then we're also doing the West Side again on the 25th. We are doing, Connie Boyd will be doing the downtown ghost story. So if you don't want to do the walk, you don't want to brave the elements, that's okay. We completely understand. You can come in this spot right here in the warm confines of the museum and listen to all the stories and not have to move a muscle. So that's at 7 o'clock that night. Our next guest speaker will actually be yours truly on October 29th. I'll be talking about Land Office Day, since this year, actually on October 13th, will be our 130th birthday. So I will tell you what happened on the biggest party in Batavia's history. So, and then our next Java with Joe will be the 26th. Jim Marasco and Bart Dentino will be here doing Vincenzo's Dream, which some of you may have seen it in other places, but it's music accompaniment with some poetry to James' ancestor, Vincenzo, who came here to Batavia. So a lot happening, and just a couple other things that people wanted me to talk about real quick. GCC's History Club does their Historical Horizons lecture. That's every first Wednesday, October through December for the fall semester. So check that out. This Sunday is the Batavia Train Show up at GCC. It's always a huge one if you're into that. And next weekend is the quilt show out in Alexander. So it's not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. So be sure to check everything out, and we hope to see you again here at the museum.
Thanks, Ryan.